This week, we look at a forthcoming graphic memoir from Street Noise Books, The Murder Next Door. I talked to the author, Hugh D'Andrade, who was 10 years old when his next-door neighbor was mysteriously murdered, and he saw the body. In this book, he discusses the trauma this caused him as the experience stuck with him over decades, and he explores the question, if someone else has had a worse experience than mine, does that mean my trauma is less important than theirs? You'll hear my interview with Hugh, and then Jason and I review the book. First, Deconstructing Comics is now on Blue Sky. Look us up at Decon Comics. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. I'm talking with Hugh D'Andrade in Oakland, California. He's an illustrator and the author of the graphic novel The Murder Next Door. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So first, before we get to the book, tell us a little about yourself, like where you grew up and so forth.
Oh, sure. Well, I grew up in the suburbs of San Diego. And moved up to Oakland in the previous century in order to study art, become an artist. And I sort of became an illustrator, and have been working as an illustrator and a graphic designer now for, over 30 years. And I did a lot of, illustration work for lots of clients, some rock posters for sometimes big name acts like Elvis Costello or the Pixies. Mm-hmm. Young adult book covers. I did one for one of the hit books I did a cover for was A Tale Dark and Grim by Adam Gidwitz. It was actually a series of 3 kind of retellings of the Grimm's fairy tales.
Yeah, and I can see a lot of book covers on your site, including the Enola Holmes mystery series.
Yeah, that's right. They turned that into a Netflix. Both of those got turned into Netflix movies, shows.
Okay. And some gates that you did for Burning Man. People walk into these figures' mouths.
Yeah, they were these like giant gates that were like the mouth of a devil or a girl, and you would walk through the gate and you'd be inside the central arena at Burning Man in 2015. I did a lot of work for Burning Man posters and ticket designs and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's go straight to the book. Is this your first book?
Yeah, indeed. So this is my first book. It's called The Murder Next Door. And it's about the fact that my next door neighbor was murdered, violently murdered when I was 10 years old. And my friends and I, her sons, discovered the body together. And, it was a very traumatic event from my childhood. But I somehow got the message that I should sort of move on from this. Of course, it wasn't my mother who had been killed. And I was aware of the immense suffering of my friends, and that mine was less. And I think I took that to heart somehow, that I should not be bothered. But of course I was. And, at some point I realized, I say this in the book, at some point I realized I had thought about it every day for 40 years. My mind ruminated on it often, although I rarely ever spoke about it. And in therapy, I started talking more about it with my therapist, and then I started opening up with my friends and even sometimes strangers to discuss this thing from my past. And what I've really found was, first, that, wow, a lot of other people have something that they're carrying around that they're also not talking about. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I found was that there was something I had been trying to sweep under the rug, some lessons that this trauma was trying to teach me. And that's why it was always knocking on the door of my mind and sort of causing me to ruminate on it, because it was trying to teach me something. And so this book is the results. It's like what happened when I turned and listened to the trauma. And then I've put those ideas together to share it with others.
Okay. So what do you think it taught you?
Well, I mean, one thing is that it taught me, and I had to accept, was that it may not have been my mother, but it really did impact me, and that that's okay. That everybody recovers from an event like this differently. Another person might have gone through something identical to me and moved on quite quickly. But for me, with the type of person that I was, a young person with a pretty active imagination, I had a tendency to imagine worst case scenarios or just imagine the murderer coming for me. And it was a big part of my childhood
Hmm.
that I had these nightmares. And um, another is that I noticed that the lack of closure that we had from this murder, since for many, many years, the murderer was not identified. There were some leads, the leads never panned out. We didn't know who had done it. And that kind of creates that lack of closure lingers
Hmm.
for the victims. And when we did finally get word, there was a police report. They identified who the killer was. He had already was deceased already. But it did bring me some closure, and I'm hopeful that it did for the family as well. Um, so there were things like that. And other elements that we could talk about. But the main thing is that it was trying to teach me something, and I had to like turn and listen to it, and I had been pushing it away. And I think that that's not the way to deal with it. And I hope that like I wrote this book hoping other people when they have something like this that troubles them in their mind that they could learn to you know have a practice of
Hmm.
listening to it.
Well, yeah, and there's this idea in the book of maybe feeling like, well, my situation wasn't as bad as somebody else's, so it's not so important, and you just kind of discount it. And but if you have trauma, you have trauma, regardless of how bad somebody else might consider that situation to have been. So yeah, we all should all listen to what our brain is telling us on that.
I have a line that I gave to my therapist in that scene, and I had him say, you know, um, everybody's suffering deserves to be witnessed,
Hmm.
you know, or wants to be witnessed, and
Hmm.
so and that is maybe partly why I wrote the book too, is to allow to tell my story of how it impacted me, just to get it off my shoulders.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And your younger self in the book realizes that safety is a lie. And I thought that was interesting because, yeah, we're always in, almost always in a little bit of danger from something. The car that doesn't hit us, the knife that we don't accidentally cut ourselves with. So, how do you think about safety now as an adult, having gone through
Oh,
this?
definitely. And I think that is really true that we are always in some level of danger. And as an adult, you become aware of this fact and you kind of make peace with it. There could always be a car accident. There could always be some murderer or mugger lurking around the corner that's going to attack you. But mostly it doesn't happen. And we come to some understanding of the proportionality of risk. Um, Children don't really have brains that are designed to think that way in terms
Mm,
of relative dangers. And so they live in a kind of world in which imagining that the things are safe. I think it's really important for kids to think that things are safe. And just like it's important for them at some point to set those illusions aside. So maybe it's a little like Santa Claus. It's something you believe, and at a certain point you realize, hey, this isn't really how the world works. And it certainly was a shock for me. Perhaps if it comes at you all at once when you're 10 years old, that lack of safety. There is a scene in my book in which my father is trying to tell me that there's no risk, that this killer isn't going to come back to,
mm,
to attack me. He will stop this killer. And I'm saying, well, the police said that the killer was a large man, a strong person. My father was a, academic
hmm.
who didn't seem to me to have the chops to fight off a guy with a knife. And he said, well, he won't come. And I'm like, well, he came once before.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
How can you say with 100% certainty nothing's going to happen?
that's right. That's right. And so I was just emerging into this understanding of the proportionality of risk. And in some ways here, we've all, just as a society, we just lived through a moment around the pandemic where we all had to study the relative risks of various scenarios and
Mm,
figure out, well, if I wear a mask and other people wear a mask, that will not make it so that I will not ever get the virus, but it will reduce the likelihood. And we all do things in our regular lives. I personally religiously lock my front door, have always done so.
mm,
Never leave the front door unlocked because I don't know who's going to walk in, you
mm,
know? Yeah.
mm.
Reducing my risk.
Yeah. In the recounting of your 10-year-old self seeing the murder victim, you show, and it comes up later in the book too, there were like spots of blood around the floor, like not just in that room even, but elsewhere. But did they ever figure out why that was the case? I don't think the book ever addresses that.
There was some confusion about this, and it does talk about this in a scene where I'm talking with one of my high school classmates at a high school
Oh,
reunion.
Django, yeah.
Yeah, he's asking me about the murder, and there were these blood drips that went from one room to the other, and it was always a mystery. At least that was my memory from when I was a child. Few things I knew about the murder, like why did that happen? Was the victim going from one sink to another? The drips went from one sink to another, almost as if perhaps she was washing the
Uh,
wound out. Um, Later, I realized, though, in the process actually of doing this book, I thought, well, you know what? I think it must have been the killer's blood. There was some of his blood recovered at the site, and then the DNA evidence was not strong enough at that time in the 80s. This happened in 1978.
mhm.
Uh, in 70s and 80s and 90s, the DNA evidence was not strong enough to come
Yeah,
to a conclusion.
technology
Uh,
wasn't there.
there was a struggle. I mean, basically, what this is a result of her fighting back.
Hmm.
She fought back. There was a very fierce struggle, and I didn't really want to go that much into it, but the site was quite disrupted.
Mm.
Yeah.
And we still don't know a motive, right? Because you couldn't arrest him and ask him.
No, when the murderer was identified years later through DNA evidence using the same method that identified the Golden State Killer, which is, using those DNA databases. One of his relatives has uploaded their DNA to 23andMe or some other DNA genealogy site,
Hmm.
and that becomes a database that the cops can query. And when they did that, they found, oh, this person is their relative is in the database, and they were able to identify it as this man who had visited the home of the victim and I think did upholstery on a chair.
Ah, yeah, that's what the
And
book says. Yeah.
yeah, and then I think he came back and committed this criminal act. We have no idea why, and there's no answer. There's no you can have. It's great to have closure to know who it was,
Hmm.
but then you have the problem that we can't understand a crime like this. It's so far outside the normal processes of a normal person. The
Hmm.
lack of empathy. It's just not what we understand as being human. you know.
Yeah,
But of course, it is a behavior that we have seen throughout history.
sure.
Often men kill women, and that's just the world that we live in.
Yeah, maybe he was like a really too sensitive person and he thought he was slighted by her somehow when he was there to upholster the chair. Who knows?
I mean, or perhaps an obsessive. We just don't know. I mean, I would imagine somebody like that, their mind is just so disrupted
Uh huh.
by some, a chemical process that's out of control that something has gone badly haywire. But we just can't know, and that's one of the things that I do talk about in the book too, is trying to imagine what who he was. He, would have been an ordinary person who, perhaps he was beaten as a child, or perhaps he never received attention, as many children don't. They
Hmm.
never get any parenting or any true empathy from a parent, and they don't develop in the proper way. So, once that had happened and we had a name for the person, though, I could imagine him being a real person. Prior to that, he was this like cipher, this ghostly, superhuman, just unstoppable force from my nightmares. Yeah.
Right, yeah, and you picture him in the book as kind of, terrifying shadow person with a knife.
Yes, yes. Just a shadow, just a faceless shadow is how he came to me in my nightmares.
Hmm.
Yeah. And later on, I talk in the book about how I was always just too self-preserving to ever see a horror film. If I ever did see a horror film, it would leave a mark.
Hmm.
I would remember it, and it would, cause its own forms of trauma.
Hmm.
Uh, Later, I did grow to appreciate the art form, and I saw some of the murder, sort of slasher films from the 80s. And I noticed how the killer was exactly how the killer in the like Jason in the is it Friday the 13th
I
or
think
Hollywood
so. Yeah, I was never a
Halloween?
horror movie person, but yeah, I think it's
You
Friday the
know how
13th is
he's
Jason. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know how he's this unstoppable force, and he's always 5 steps ahead of you, and he just is completely implacable foe.
Hmm.
That's how I imagined the murderer as well.
Yeah. In some of the scenes where you're in therapy in the book, I liked how you include. There were some moments where you and the therapist made each other laugh.
Yeah.
Like he said some things that you laughed at, and vice versa. So, talk about your thoughts on including those moments in the book. I mean, it's not a book that I would necessarily expect any humor in.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Yeah, there is some. Yeah, I do use humor to get through life, I guess.
Sure.
And one of the things about I don't see that therapist any longer because I did therapy for a period of about 15 years, and
Hmm.
after 15 years, I thought, oh, I think I've paid off enough of this guy's mortgage.
He bought a boat.
But he was a very good therapist. Not a perfect therapist, but a good enough therapist. And one thing about a good therapist that you have a good connection with is that you will laugh together. There's more than just the serious, you know, difficult work of dredging through unpleasant memories or unpleasant thoughts. There's also some joy. And
Hmm.
I think that's part of the healing process too.
Sure.
And so I often tell people that if people will ask me sometimes, and my partner is a therapist too. So I thought a lot about therapy. And when people ever say, "Hey, should I get a therapist?" I say, "Well, find one that you can laugh with."
Hmm. Yeah, and yeah, humor can be a healthy way to deal with difficult things.
Yeah.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, the murder case is finally resolved many years later, and that's in the book. What would you have done in the book if the case had never been solved? How would the book be different?
God, that's a really good question. And I don't know quite how to answer that, except to say that I was definitely thinking about doing this book long before the cops came up with this answer.
Hmm.
In part because I was interested in that problem I mentioned earlier of the lack of closure and the way that that was impacting me, and I saw it impacting my community as well. I saw that we would get word, sort of whispers I would hear that somebody might suspect the husband in this case, who was also a family friend and was
Hmm.
the next door neighbor who was the doctor who would come over and, give you a little care when you had a cold. And he was a wonderful, warm, kind-hearted man
Yeah,
who
that
could.
would have been traumatic all over again to find out he was the murderer.
And it just wasn't even a question. He had a very solid alibi because he, in fact, was at a hospital helping people. Uh, you know,
Yeah.
but this kind of rumor would be persistent because of that lack of closure, right? And
Hmm.
I had been interested in that and the way that that lack of closure that people have around other events as well causes people to want to find a solution and make something up. So I had noticed that I had this very strong, passionate anger at people who were conspiracy theorists and would make things up about 9/11 or the JFK assassination or vaccines for that matter.
Hmm.
And you find that people oftentimes if they cannot accept an answer about an event in reality, or if the answer is unknowable, their minds cannot accept that, and so they invent an explanation, and that explanation is often false and not very helpful. So I was already really interested in that question. But then when the cops did do this, and they very cleverly did it on the 40th anniversary of the murder. They closed this cold case.
Yeah, 78, 2018. Yeah.
I suppose they had solved it in advance and then just waited for the anniversary and then announced it, because it was in our neighborhood in that part of San Diego, it was a question of like what had happened if this murder had been a
Hmm.
cold case bugging the cops for a long time. And when they did release that information, I really did felt a lessening of my suffering, slightly,
Hmm.
but enough that it was noticeable that disappearance of that phantom from my mind, and I realized at that point, oh, I've really got to do this book
Mm.
because that is such a good kind of closure moment.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. It makes closure for the reader too. Like, oh, okay, that's what happened, and it wasn't the father, and yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. About your art, I noticed a few panels in this book where that you drew in kind of a fisheye lens effect. Like, there's one where you're a kid and you're drawing, and the pen in your hand is huge because it's right up, close to the quote unquote camera, and your arm seems kind of extra long. I was wondering what your thought was doing that scene that way.
Gosh, really for me, so much of drawing comics is this is one of the challenges is that you have to pursue doing a comic in this very rigorous, very intellectual, very cold. I'm going to have this many pages. There's going to be this much text on each page, and therefore it's going to be 10 to 12 pages, and you have to pursue it so methodically. And yet, in my way of drawing, I've always allowed happy accidents to happen,
Hmm.
allowed my unconscious to spill out. And I found it very difficult to do a comic and still have it have the energy that I like in my sketches. And so, one of the processes that I discovered was to draw a chapter over and over again and allow it
Wow.
and start doing it really loosely. And so sometimes if I did it really loosely, I'd go, "Oh, look at that! A weird fisheye lens appears." Sometimes at moments of kind of heightened excitement or tension is when that would appear. And
Hmm.
I certainly, it's not conscious. It just would arise, and then I would notice it, and then I would try to pursue it and draw it as best I could. It's a tough thing with comics. You have to work so quickly. You really can't, if you spend 5 days on a page and you're going over budget on your time,
Yeah.
yeah. So you just make do, and that is also part of my aesthetic too. The readers that pick up the book will find, I think people can see that I'm a pretty adequate illustrator, but that I allow a lot of the flaws and the awkwardness of the hand-drawn aesthetic to remain in the work. And I do that really intentionally. I really want the work not to be too slick. I find I personally don't like comic art or graphic novels that are too slick.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I like it if they feel a little like you've picked up somebody's journal.
Hmm.
You started reading it and you're like discovering, oh my God, I'm inside somebody's brain. This is so strange.
And mentions in the back of the book you draw on paper. You're not using computer for that part of it.
Yeah, that's right. And I do the same. I've always done the same for all of my poster work, and my young adult novel illustration work. I use pen and ink on paper, just ink on Bristol, and then I scan it in, and then I do more sophisticated color work using, Procreate on an iPad or using Photoshop on a laptop or desktop. Um, and I that's just the way that I've worked. It's really nice, gets me a happy medium between something that is slick and presentable, but still has that rough-hewn quality that I like. I just want to hold on to that hand-drawn quality. And I also made a note in the back of the book that there was no AI used in the creation of this book.
Yeah, at the top of your website, there's a large illustration of this blue cat is holding, it looks like kind of a snake or something, and
Yes.
it feels kind of 3D. How did you do that? The cat is so kind of rounded.
It's just an illustration technique. Yeah, I did that as part of an art show, and it's one of the ones that I think, in fact, the only one from that art show in 2013 that didn't sell. Um, and I had been doing work that was very flat for so much of my career, so much flat kind of silhouette work or very, just flat color. Just that's was my aesthetic. That was what clients came to me for. And I thought, oh, if I'm going to do an art show, I want to just let go and do some shading and then really make it pop. And
Hmm.
so that piece has a sort of very three-dimensional shading, but it's also quite artificial looking. So I like that quality where it's right on the line between looking realistic and looking artificial.
Hmm.
Mhm.
I see. Something else I noticed on your website. Tell me about this tarot card project you're involved in.
Oh, that was really fun. A friend of mine put this together. It was a tarot deck with multiple artists. I mean, different artists for each hand. I think I did three or four different characters um, for the deck. And I'm not a tarot person, so I cannot tell you whether it was a King of Cups or which exact characters I did, but it was a really it's a really interesting tradition where the symbolism is so fascinating. So you end up you do a deep dive on the symbolism and then you come up with your own version of it. And this deck, which people can read about, yeah, on my website, you can get it, and there's it's a very diverse uh, expression of tarot there because multiple different artists.
Yeah, that sounds almost jarring, kind of, if the the cards are done by different artists. But I assume that your friend had some way to kind of make them all feel integrated and part
It's
of the
very
same
well
thing.
designed. I mean, that's where graphic design comes in. You create a really good graphic design, then you can unify things. You can let the imagery
Hmm.
change from one place to another, and but stays locked down. It still looks cohesive.
Hmm.
It's a fine product for people that are tarot aficionados.
So, do you plan on doing any more comics?
I do. Yeah, I'm gonna be hard pressed to find something that's as raw as this.
Hmm.
So I'm not sure that I'll do another memoir for the time being. But I
Hmm.
have a number of subjects that I'm interested in. One is a historical subject. I'm interested in the JFK assassination
Hmm.
and have been for many years. And then I'm also still interested in the workings of my own mind. So perhaps I could do a memoir about ADHD.
Oh.
Is another thing I've been thinking about. I suffer from just enormous amounts of ADHD that has held me back and is probably the thing that prevented me from doing comics for all these years. Um, and yet I don't see it as a deficit. I see it as a great gift. So I'm interested in doing comics about that subject. I know there are many at this point. Several people have done comics about that subject. Or possibly a brain type common to graphic novelists.
Maybe so. Or yeah, doing a book about being a loner. Yeah, there are no comics artists who are loners. None.
Oh gosh, so much self-loathing in comic art, right? From Joe Matt to Arkrum. Folks, there's so much self-loathing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so do you have any projects coming we should be watching for?
Well, let's see. Not really offhand. I'm at the moment doing promotional work for my current book and ruminating over what my next project will be. Um, People are always invited to follow my work at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So I have a day job as the creative director for this great nonprofit, the EFF. Electronic Frontier Foundation. We fight for your civil liberties in the online world, and I do most of the art. There's a couple of other artists that I get to work with, but the visual aesthetic is something I've developed at that organization, and that's where a lot of my energies go.
I see.
Unfortunately or unfortunately.
Okay. Well, yeah, good to talk to you today. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, and it's been great talking to you.
Coming up, Jason and I talk about The Murder Next Door. How did Hugh do at telling his story? By the way, don't forget we have a voicemail. To leave us a message, click the Leave a Voicemail link on the sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. This podcast is part of the Deconstructing Comics Network, where we're grateful to our supporters on Patreon. Patrons get exclusive extra content. At $2 a month and up, hear Bat Bits, a Batman 66 exploration with my brother Paul. At $4 a month, you also get our new monthly show Silver Age Batman, where I discuss Batman comics from the 50s and 60s with either Paul, Patrick, Emmett, or Kumar, as well as our previous series on Jim Starlin's run on Captain Marvel and the first 50 issues of Amazing Spider-Man by Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and John Romita. Check it out at patreon.com/deconcomics. And thanks for your support.
Hey, I'm Jen.
And I'm Sean. We're here to tell you about our podcast, Worst Collection Ever.
And this is the show where we tell you about the worst comic book collection in existence. And it just happens to belong to us.
We have some of the worst comics from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They're bad.
Terrible.
They're not worth anything.
No good.
Why do we own
Very
them?
bad.
I own a number of issues of Terror Inc. and Guy Gardner.
Basically, we go around to local comic book stores and we buy everything we can out of dollar boxes.
We tell you about the weird stuff in them. We tell you about stuff that's related to them. We go into tangents. And we're very uninformed, so...
Oh my god, totally. But totally check out our podcast because you'll hear us just talk and joke about Marvel books and DC books from God only knows when.
That's right. It's our show, Worst Collection Ever, every Tuesday on iTunes, Stitcher, anywhere you get your podcasts. Download, rate, subscribe, tell a friend.
It'll be good and terrible, but good.
All right, so now I'm with Jason. Hello, Jason.
Greetings, Tim. How are you?
Okay, yeah, so we heard the interview, and so now we're going to take a look at the book and give some opinions about it. The Murder Next Door. Now it's been a couple of weeks since I did the interview. I was trying to remember how to pronounce his name. Hugh D'Andrade, I believe it was. Not how I would have guessed, but yeah. So So what did you think of this book?
First off, oddly enough, I had already pre-ordered this book.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I had already heard about it and thought it was right up my alley. So I'm already predispositioned to this material. But I am also a huge fan of true crime and nonfiction work and memoirs. And so much about this book either worked for me or was like parallel to things that I have thought and gone through. It really hit so many nerves for me. I was really excited by it. I'm really happy with it for many reasons, which I'll go on and on about the next 10 minutes. But first off, I just want to say it's done like the illustration style is not something I think I see enough of. And I would almost, at first glance, I'm like, this is sort of like Robert Crumb. And then I also thought it sort of felt like my best friend Dahmer Is that what it's called?
Oh, yeah. My Friend Dahmer by
My Friend Dahmer.
Durf.
Yeah, it reminded me of some other autobiographical stories in that it really felt like a cartoonist did this, like an illustrator did this.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a lot of mark making with an ink brush. It had a lot of texture, and the use of one. There's two colors. There is sort of like a light blue, and then there is the striking red for certain moments.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that contrast just really, really elevated the material. It's really beautiful. And even though a lot of this is talking heads, he uses a lot of smart storytelling decisions to make certain moments pop. Every net, like he'll switch from point of view. He'll do like a low angle or a Dutch angle, and the kid's walking into his house to tell his mother there's a body next door. He picks the right moments. You could have taken some of those moments and made them little panels, but he opens them up at the right time.
Like
Really
give me an example.
I think it's page 48, I believe. Yeah, it's page 49 in the. It's not PDF page 49. It's page 49 at the bottom when they're numbered.
Uh-huh.
And he walks into his mother's. He walks back into his house, takes one step foot in, opens the door, and it's like a deep perspective shot looking up at a child.
Yeah, that fisheye lens effect I asked him about in the interview.
I would call that a Dutch angle, but it's really hard to get the proportions right on something like that. He does a really, really excellent job of the perspective and making the body fade backwards and the foot and the hand are in the foreground. And then other times he does really cartoony stuff. Like on page 48, he saves time doing the silhouette of the character moving up the stairs. So all of it just really, really sang for me. I was really, really impressed by this. Also, with true crime, we get like the grisly details of the crime. We get the hunt for the killer. He avoids all those trappings. He's not telling that story at all. He's telling a very personal story about how this sort of tragedy has a ripple effect throughout the community, through his household, that stays with these people long afterwards. And that's not something that gets explored enough in true crime. Right? It's not about the manhunt. It's about like the lingering effects of tragedy on people.
Yeah, it's about trauma. It's kind of a graphic medicine type of comic.
Yeah, and how it affects an entire community, not just the people. You just don't lose a person. The whole community has an effect, and his innocence was taken away as a young man. He also talks about something I think is really interesting, in that trauma is not hierarchical. In that, and you find this a lot in real life. Like you'll say, "Oh, I had this terrible thing happen to me," and you say it to someone, and they go, "Oh yeah, well, my parents pushed me through a meat grinder." It's just gonna
top you,
yeah, and it's like it's all valid. And it's not a contest, and everyone's pain is valid, and it's okay to let that in. So part of this is like it happened to the next door neighbor, it happened to his friends. It didn't happen. There's a way to look at this book. Well, it didn't happen to you, but it did happen to him. A part of his community was ripped out, and he was right there. And also, he saw the body.
He saw the body, and then his friends disappeared after that too. He didn't. Yeah. He lost his friends, even though they didn't die. Yeah. Yeah.
So the killer murdered part of his childhood, murdered something within him, and murdered his friendships. Like, these are things that don't get explored often in these little sound bites or these little, like, we have to catch, the Golden State Killer. We focus on like the hunt. So I thought this was a really excellent memoir, and he focuses it. He's really smart in that he doesn't go on any tangents about anything else. Everything is about his experience that revolves around this event, and we check in with him at a few different points in his life and how it drove him or affected his behavior. I just thought so I was really, really enamored with it. He also goes to his 30th high school reunion at one point, and last year I went to my 30th high school reunion. He lived in the East Bay, I lived in the East Bay, so a lot of his experiences are parallel to mine. I never had I didn't have the tragedy that he had, but I've had my own tragedies, and he captures things that most people wouldn't know if you weren't there. For example, I had an aunt who was murdered. This was years ago, and in this book, he's talking about how the news will put up the wrong house. They're like, "There's a murderer," and he's like, "That's not the right house." Like, how do you get things wrong? And I remember my father being so upset reading the paper, reading about his sister's murder and be like, they got everything wrong. They got her name right and everything else was wrong. He was furious. And I remember being like, well, why is that such a big deal? Like, we lost my aunt, your sister. but those things reverberate with you. You're like it feels like the rest of the world is not taking it seriously.
Well, anytime, like any topic something about gets covered on the news, you're like, what? They screwed it up.
Right.
I've seen that all the time in less tragic circumstances, but yeah.
Yeah, with every Marvel movie. They didn't get it right.
But yeah, what also struck me, what you mentioned about how there's kind of a sense, we kind of feel like, oh, his tragedy was worse than mine, and I shouldn't feel so bad because what happened to somebody else was worse, like they lost half their family in the Holocaust or something. But yeah, that doesn't really matter. It's, what did you go through? How did you feel about it? That's the trauma. It might be the same trauma that somebody else had, regardless of what happened to them, and if it was quote unquote better or worse.
Yeah. It's not a contest. Like, we can all accept that these things happen and that they hurt, and internal scars are so much harder to explain to people. So I think this book could be really helpful to people to address trauma and to accept it and to normalize it. Like, it happened and I'm going to deal with it, and it doesn't matter if the person next to me, their entire family died or whatever. It's all valid.
I was interested by the way he started the book with like going to this kind of meditation retreat thing and sitting in the lotus position and it kind of gives us a sense he feels like something is wrong with him, but we don't know exactly what it is yet. I mean, we see the title of the book is The Murder Next Door, so we know there was a murder, but I liked how it kind of drew you in to it makes you curious, like what exactly happened to him, what's he feeling upset about, and then he sees an image of himself as a 10-year-old crying, and that's the first scene.
That is a common thing in, as someone who's also spent many, many, many years in therapy, that is also a sort of, I think it's a Jungian therapy tool where they make you talk to your younger self. So I also just knew...
has a big conversation with himself at the end.
Yeah, and that's good to close the loop. I also thought, when I saw him going to like a quiet yoga retreat, the first thing that came into my mind was, oh, he lives in Northern California.
Ding, 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 ding.
Yeah. But being isolated with your body, you do sort of find things you wouldn't normally see. We're so distracted all the time. We rarely just sit and let our body tell us things. But, the human body is the best computer on the planet. But yeah, it's just the illustrations, like on page 10, where this leads up to that splash page where he's like, what am I feeling? Oh, it's me. We fill our lives all these things to distract us. And like he said in the interview with you, he thinks about this every day. Mm-hmm. And that made me think about, like, there are things that I return to all the time, just at a cursory glance, and I just think of them as like a permanent part of my internal food pyramid. Like, it's just there. Like, it's just like a new thing you walk past every day.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, I think a lot of us have that. There's also a really good visual metaphor. This is a very internal book, and he makes a lot of smart choices on how to externalize that or rather visualize that conflict. And at one point he talks about like this, there's a hole inside of him. Something I really related to, and I thought it was really strongly illustrated.
Yeah, and there's people kind of walking around this big crater, and like some people ignore it, some people find a way to get around it or over it. And yeah, that's just this representing like, all the bad things that can happen in life.
Yeah, he does a really good job of positioning it in a way where the main character feels like they don't have power in relation to this giant hole, and it juxtapositions it with him as a young man and then him as an old man looking down the hole, and then you realize, like, this is something that stays with you, and that the hole is always there no matter where you are in your life, and that this book pops around throughout his life sort of also reinforces that. I thought it was just really well edited too, like just really well curated. Well, it will be in the past, and we'll be leading up to finding the body and about to tell his mom, and then we jump into the present or the near present, and then we go back and bump around a bit, and just see how this thing rippled throughout a life. It didn't just ripple when he was 10. It's an echo that bounces back and forth. I also would assume, I did not look at his website, but I would assume based on some of the art that I'm seeing, some of his splash pages, that he has a strong background in editorial cartoons or editorial illustration.
Huh. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Talking about trauma, I thought it was interesting at the end, like after the killer is identified, and so now that kind of takes a big weight off of him because now he knows who that was and the guy is dead. But he also, is kind of conscious enough to say, like, maybe the killer had his own trauma that shaped him.
He had empathy. Yeah.
Yeah.
He has empathy. And he has empathy for people on the street. And I just think he unfortunately learned at a really young age that you don't know everything about everybody. And that people might have secrets that are causing them great deals of pain. Like he talks about that to great effect. There was one in your conversation with him. They talk about how the blood splatter, and there's an element in here about how he's viewing the crime scene and trying to make sense of it. This is just a statistic, but when people are murdered with a knife or a sharp implement, often the attacker is also often injured in the same event. It's not like a gun or something. If there's a struggle and there's a blade, often both people are injured, and there's a lot of the blood. And if it's from sink to sink, he may be trying to clean up after himself, maybe like cleaning the wound and then bleeding as he goes to another part of the house. But yeah, as far as like the motivation too, like you don't know what's going on.
We'll never know.
It could be any number of things. And then now that the person is gone, even if they weren't, sometimes you just don't know. Some people are just deeply, deeply unwell in a way that is not obvious.
For me, one of the more powerful parts of the book is near the end there, after he's found out the killer's identity and everything, and he's at therapy, and he comes out and there's a doormat there that says "here." So like he's not stuck in 1978 anymore. He's able to kind of live in the present now, finally.
Yeah, I saw that too. I also thought that might just be a therapist gag about being present. Which is often a hard thing to do. To be honest, is to be present in the moment with your feelings and being honest and just being placed in the world and letting that experience wash over you. Page 148. That's another great splash page of a perspective looking down on him and his mom crying in the church. Just a brushwork, bringing the eye towards the center that way, that have the balance of the blacks and the blues. Just really, really, for his first, this is his first graphic novel, but obviously he is a very talented visual storyteller in his other work. The other thing I wanted, I was happy to see was at the end, there's a little, some notes at the end of the book. It's a memoir, which means it's mostly true. He relied on faulty memory. That's true of all memoirists. Like nothing is fact, especially if you're a storyteller by trade. You embellish things, or your mind makes sense out of things that you can't always make sense of. So I like that he brought that to the forefront. I also want to point out that he went to the comics MFA program at the California College of Arts, which meant he trained with our old friends Matt Sillity and Justin Hall.
Yeah, I noticed that too, and I didn't know about Justin, but Matt certainly. I know he teaches there to this day, right?
Yeah, Matt and Justin there are both.
They're both.
They might both be. They might be both department heads at this point. But
I haven't talked to Matt in a long time.
He's still there.
He's been on the show, way back in the mists of history, but it's been quite a while.
Well, he was barely on the show because I was drunk and talking over him. So maybe you should have him back on without me around.
Well, he was on more than once. There were a couple times that we talked on Skype. I think the when I initially interviewed him, well, yeah, that's been a long time ago. I don't know if anybody listening remembers this, but Brandon and I had talked about his book, what was that called? The
Homeless Channel.
Homeless Channel.
Right.
And we had some issues with it, and he reached out to us about it and was very nice about it.
Honestly, that's the way to handle criticism. Is to embrace it. It's okay, and that means people are talking about your work.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and all he did was get more publicity for his work. So for anyone who's like, you know, if you get a bad review, just reach out to that person and thank them for their time, because people's time has value.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. And also you could turn a negative into a positive. So now you remember him, you know, 15 years later, maybe.
Yeah. And then we had him on a couple more times after that. But yeah, it's been a while. Anyway, but yeah, I'm not giving a bad review to this book at all. This is lovely.
Yeah, it really hit me. It really hit me today, and I read it once, and I want to sit it down and read it again in a week or two. But I think, even though this is coming, I don't know if this is in stores yet. I pre-ordered it.
It's not coming till February.
Good, because this deserves to be on the best of 2025 list.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really strong work, and this is the type of thing that could go really wrong if it wasn't written well. This could be really pandering and self-serving.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first saw the title and I read about what it was about, I thought this could go one of two ways. It's either going to be really like navel gazing, or it could be really powerful. And it is the latter. It is very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a number of really powerful scenes in it.
Yeah,
and overall, it works really well.
Yeah, and just like finding the murder, like, based on the title, there's a lot of anticipation. There's a lot of dread. Given that what it's about, when he's a young man and he's 10 with his friends, I just felt such a pit in my stomach knowing what was going to happen next.
Mm-hmm.
I rarely, as a reader, do I want to know what's going to happen next. I want to find out with the main character, and I want to have that empathy with the main character and that connection with the point of view character. But in this case, it really amped up the suspense and dread, knowing what young Hugh was going to walk into, because the whole time you're like, don't go in there.
Yeah.
Just call the police. Don't go in there, Hugh. It's going to change your life. But we have that same feeling probably with ourselves, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Also, he's taking the BART, and of course, as a crazy person on the BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, I completely empathize with that. I just have so many horror stories around the BART. Yeah, so much of this hit and paralleled things I went through, and I just really, really appreciated it. I thought it was really well done.
Mm-hmm.
So, who published this? I had never heard of the publisher.
Let's see here.
It is Street Noise Books in Brooklyn, New York. Get out of here. It's the murder next door.
Yeah, Street Noise Books. Have not heard of it either.
Well, I'm going to remember them now because this book is great. You know what? I do think, so there's the cover, and then there is this interior art cover. I like the second cover better, the one that they don't use, the one that's the internal page.
With Hugh and the shadow of
I
murderer.
love that. It's so stark with the black and white and the minimal blue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But, you know, obviously they know something that obviously they're better at what they do than me. Don't listen to me. But I like that illustration quite a bit.
But
so I hope to see more from Hugh.
Yeah, and I'm gonna ask Street Noise to keep in touch. They reached out to me about this book, and if I was interested in reviewing or interviewing him. So yeah, I'm gonna try to get on their regular distribution list.
So for example, page 116. When I talk about like editorial illustrations, page 116 with all these people, they're standing inside of a bullseye as a missile goes towards them. That to me is a perfect example of someone who really understands the art of editorial cartoons. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and that's a whole other interesting thing about this book, where he talks about when he was a college student and the first Gulf War was kind of ramping up, or it was on the horizon, and he was protesting it, this big "No Blood for Oil" banner. But it kind of meshed for him with the experience of the murder, because it was like, now a lot of people are going to die, a lot of civilians are going to die, and different from the murder, we have foreknowledge. We know it's going to happen, and he's trying to get everybody thinking like, we don't want to do this. We can prevent a bunch of people from getting killed, and he just couldn't find many people who really felt as strongly about it. And so, yeah, the people in the bullseye with the missile heading towards them are all his friend's mother, who was killed in 78. It's a really powerful way to show it, rather than showing a bunch of like Iraqi civilians or something. We're showing just her again and again. So how he feels about it, how he sees it in his mind.
And he's having empathy for the future victims' families on the other side.
Yeah,
that when the bombs drop, like other people are going to suffer the way he suffered, and those communities will be rocked the same way that his community was. He also really talks about the absence of knowledge, how not knowing who the killer was just caused all this suspicion and sort of bad relationships within his community. Even people had solid alibis. Like, not knowing is worse. And how he talked about when the killer was found, even though the killer had already passed, and ancestral DNA is a huge way to catch people now. There is closure, and I'm glad that they got that, because many people don't. But yes, I could go on and on. I just was really high recommends for Murder Next Door.
Yeah,
and hopefully we get more work from Hugh and Street Noise in the near future.
Yeah.
For fans of my friend Dahmer, or The Green River Killer was a good graphic novel by Dark Horse Comics a couple years ago. Anyone who likes autobiographical or true crime stories, this is a very different take and really, really well done.
The Murder Next Door goes on sale February 4th, 2025. To see some of Hugh's other work, go to hughillustration.com. The link is in the show notes. Thanks to our patrons for supporting Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and our other podcasts. To join them, go to patreon.com/deconcomics. At deconstructingcomics.com, you can connect to us on X, Facebook, YouTube, and now Blue Sky, and find links to subscribe to the podcast. You can comment on any episode on our site, drop us a line at mail@deconstructingcomics.com, or talk to us. Click the Leave a Voicemail link on the left sidebar of our site. Are you making a comic? Send it to us and we'll do a Critiquing Comics episode about it. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. The music backing the promotion of our Patreon is Change by Jazar. Back in July, Kumar and I took a look at the first omnibus volume of Mitsuru Adachi's manga Cross Game, a baseball story overlaying the real story about dealing with tragedy and remembering someone we've lost, but also including a fair amount of goofy comedy and fourth wall breaking. Next week, we finally come back to Cross Game as we discuss the second omnibus, which includes regular-sized volumes 4 and 5, so be here for that next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.